Gmar Tov to you all. Gmar Chatamat Tova. I hope you had a meaningful Yom Kippur and a wonderful Yom Narayim and full of meaningful Divrei Torah and Tefillah. And we are jumping right in. So let us share screen. And this is where we are. We are still at the end of Perek Bet. More or less where we left off last week was a discussion, or was it last week? Yes, it was last week. So much has happened. Was a discussion of Shlomo HaMelech and his connection to this particular Perek in all of his facets. And ultimately, we linked that to the moment when, or the three themes of Kohelet, the Amal, the Nehentan, and the Chacham, the philosopher, the hedonist, and the builder. We connected all three to Shlomo HaMelech, not just in terms of Shlomo being the wisest of all men kind of thing, Chacham Mikol Adam, but really because those three elements define the bulk of Shlomo's life. And we even went back to the moment in which that triad begins, which is the moment of the dream that he has in Giv'on, when he goes to build the Beit HaMikdash, and he has a dream, and God asks him what it is that you want, and he says he would like to be given Chochmah, wisdom, Lahavin, and the language actually I pulled on the source page, Lev Shomea Lishpot et Amcha Lavin Ben Tov Lara, understanding, discerning heart to be able to judge your people, to distinguish between good and evil. And God grants him that wish and grants it to him in part, meaning it pleases God that Shlomo asked for the understanding heart, Havin Lishmo Mishpat, but for some conspicuous reason, God leaves out the phrase of Lahavin Ben Tov Lara. This distinguishing between good and evil was too close to the story of the Eitz Hadat, which we're going to come to momentarily, but that essentially is where the story of Shlomo kind of comes to a climax, where you have God says to him, I will grant you this thing that you asked for, Lev Chacham Benavon, a wise and understanding heart, meaning wisdom, and he grants him Osher and Kavod, and it seems to be in the context of Sefer Malach in the Book of Kings, granting him both wealth and honor in addition to wisdom sounds like a wonderful thing, but really it's God's, almost a tease. It's only God's way of saying, you asked for the Lavin Ben Tov Lara, which is essentially the criteria of the tree of knowledge, the Eitz Hadat Ben Tov Lara, that with that comes the entire gamut of this world. So you get osher, you get wealth and the power to build things and kavod and place your mark upon the world together with the wisdom. And those are the aspects of Shlomo's life that define everything about Shlomo. His great building campaign, building cities, and his great and his wealth of wives that he has to his extent, and all the extraordinary description of his wealth, which runs through the story sorry, I just left off the page. That runs through the story of Shlomo's own experience, and all of this, however, is conditional, and it's conditional at the end with Ve'im telech b'drachai lishmor chokai u'mitzvotai kasher alachta b'davicha v'arachti et yamecha. If you will walk in my ways, keep my statutes and my laws, then I will lengthen your days. And suddenly from this one small passage, we find ourselves facing two profound themes that we've already identified as themes that permeate the book of Kohelet. The question of Tov and Ra, Lavin Ben Tov Lara, which was the original request that Shlomo had made, Lev Shomea Lishpot et Amcha Lavin Ben Tov Lara, and the question of Arachti et Yamecha, long life. If I look at it from the perspective of the Eitz Hadat and the Eitz HaChaim, those are exactly the two poles of the book of Kohelet, as we have already identified. the question of what is Tov and what is Ra, and the question of what is the meaning of life in the shadow of death, which is part of the consequence of the story of Gan Eden. And so we left off with essentially a question. Where does all this lead us to in terms of Shlomo Melech? Why suddenly he's about to go and build the Beit HaMikdash? Why is suddenly the story of Gan Eden so central to Shlomo's moment of building the Beit HaMikdash that it now the initial contact with God before he builds the Beit HaMikdash revolves around these themes. Shlomo's life revolves around these themes, and Kohelet revolves around these themes. So for that, I want to devote this year, and maybe next week also, we'll see, to an exploration of what Gan Eden is. And it's one of those stories which is the beginning of Chumash. It kind of starts at, I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second. It kind of starts in the beginning of Chumash, story of Gan Eden, the story of Adam and Chava in Gan Eden, being expelled from Gan Eden. And then we never encounter it again. There's references here and there. There's a reference to an Eitz Chaim here. There's a reference to the Tov and Ra there. But as an event, as a place, as a central theme, if you start, forgive me for taking us into the world of literature. But if you start a text with a particular introduction, you would imagine that introduction should loom large in the context of the continuation of the story. And yet, Gan Eden seems to be, in the context of Tanakh, and I'm not talking about the rabbinic language around Gan Eden. There's a rabbinic phrase around Gan Eden which has to do with the world to come and Olam Haba that is often referred to as Gan Eden in the rabbinic literature. But I'm talking Tanakh. Where is Gan Eden beyond chapter 3? And what we're going to find is that that's a very powerful question, but but the answer is even more powerful. So we're going to jump into a whole new world. So we'll eventually come back to Shlomo, and we'll eventually come back to Kohelet. But right now, I want to take us into, we're going to work our way backwards. We're going to start from Yechezkel and work our way backwards. So for now, I want to start from Yechezkel Mem Zayin. By the way, let me just do this. This is the source page we're going to be using. We haven't started using it yet. So I'm going to post the sources here. It's the same source from last week. So if anybody needs it, it's the exact same source page I posted last week. All right. Yechezkel Mem Zayin. What's going on in Yechezkel chapter 47? It's almost the end of the book. Yechezkel, who lives in Bavel during the time of the Babylonian exile, the last 10, 11 chapters of the book of Yechezkel are dedicated to the question of the vision he has for the restoration of the Beit HaMikdash. Now, what we referred to as the vision of Bayit Shlishi, the third temple. Yechezkel didn't say the third temple. Yechezkel said the next temple. Meaning in Yechezkel's vision, this we talked about back in Daniel, Tanakh, the prophecies of Tanakh were written for their generation. And the expectation from Bavel was that they would go back to the land of Israel and they would build this temple. It didn't happen for all kinds of reasons, and so the prophecy gets deferred to a future time. But this is Yechezkel. So in the very end of this picture, after they've built this temple in his mind, right, this entire 11 chapters is sort of a vision he has of what this new built temple will look like. And the pasuk, the Parak Mem Zayin, starts with the following: Vayishiveni el petach habayit. He brought me to the door of the temple. V'hinei mayim yotzim mitachat miftan habayit kadima. Behold, there was water issuing from under the threshold eastward. Kipnei habayit kadim. The front of the house was facing the east. The water was coming down from under the right side of the temple, near the altar. So I followed it, and remember, he's in his dream, he's in his vision. There's a lot of word. Yechezkel's very wordy in some places. Essentially brought me out of the gate, and he led me to the northern gate, through the northern gate, and then he had me look outward, eastward. And this water was running off the right side of the temple. this man went forth eastward, following the line of this little trickle of water, v'kav biado, with a measuring line in his hand. He was measuring the height of the water. V'yamud elef b'ama, and he measured 1,000 cubits. V'yavireni b'mayim, and I passed through the waters that went up to my ankles, and the further he goes along this water, the taller the river that it creates gets. Another 1,000 cubits, and I found myself walking through waters up to my knees. Another 1,000 cubits, and I'm walking through waters that up to my waist. Another 1,000 cubits, and suddenly this water turned into a river, too large to even pass through. The waters had risen to the point where you could swim in them. God said to me, did you see this? So I went and I sat on the edge of the river. B'shuveni, and as I sat on the edge of this river, remember where this river started. As he's left the vision of as he's in this vision, as he's leaving the temple, he sees at the edge of the eastern gate a little bit of a trickle of water, and it's heading eastward. Very important for us. We'll see in a moment. And on either side of this river, there were trees. These waters issue forth from east towards the eastern region. So they'll go down into the Arava, the coast, the plains. Uvao hayama el hayama mutsaim, and they will go into the sea. Now, quick geography: what sea is in the Arava in Israel? What water is in the southeast of Israel?
Yam
HaMelech, the Dead Sea, the Salt Sea, the Dead Sea. Uvao hayama el hayama mutsaim. They shall go into the sea. V'nirpe'u hamayim, and the waters shall be healed. To heal the waters of the Dead Sea means to bring it back to life. Now, the solution to bringing back the Dead Sea to life is to pour into it enough fresh water that will dilute the salt that is there. But there's a simpler solution, which is simply to bring the water from the Beit HaMikdash, which we'll see in a moment. This place, this new sea that this water will create, will be a place in which every living creature that swarms in every place will be able to come. And there'll be fish, great amounts of fish. These waters will come. They shall heal the waters. Shall live. Everything shall live wherever it comes to the river. This vision of healing the Dead Sea, because it has new fresh water, but not just a source of fresh water, and a large quantity of water, and this water has a special source. Vaya amdu alav davagim me'engedi v'ad ein eglaim, a very famous nevuah, where he describes fishermen standing from Engedi to En Eglaim, mishtoach lacharamim, spreading forth their nets. There'll be so much fish in the Dead Sea. They'll have more fish and as much fish as there is in the Great Sea, not more. It's mire places, it's marshes. They shall still maintain its salt. There's a whole discussion as to why that is the case. I suspect it's so that the Dead Sea Works that mines the salt and that has a source of parnasa of the salt of the Dead Sea should still be able to function even b'mot Mashiach. It's my theory, but okay. This is very important. Now let's go back to the river. This river, on the banks of this river, on either side, mizeh, what shall you find? kol eitz ma'achal, all kinds of fruit trees. Not only fruit trees, but fruit trees asher lo yibol alehu, whose leaves shall not wither, v'lo yitom piryo, and its fruits shall not fail. Lachodeshav yivaker, new fruit every month. Ki meimav mina mikdash hem yotzim, because its waters come from the mikdash. Ve'ya piryo lemachav aleu l'trufa. Its waters shall be food, and its leaves healing. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't escape the imagery in Pasuk Yud Bet of the story of Gan Eden, which was a story about a river that irrigates an entire garden filled with Eitz Ma'achal, and a place of sanctity, and a place in which God's presence was, Kol Elokim Yitalech Bagan. And here we have water that comes from the Mikdash, and similarly has trees growing out of the water or into the banks of the river that are blessed, that are significant, that are unique, that don't wither and that are permanent and are eternal, because the water is sourced in the Mikdash. And I'm suddenly brought into a world of contrast or comparison. What is the connection between the waters of Gan Eden that brought forth all of those trees that are called Eitz Ma'achal and that were so unique and special, and the waters that emerged from the Beit HaMikdash? Is there a parallel that's being created here? Well, the Ramban certainly thought there was. I'm going to jump to the source page now for a moment. And this is the Ramban on Breshit, on Perek Bet. And we're going to get to the Psukim in Breshit in a moment. He says about Gan Eden, this is the Ramban on Gan Eden, on Perek Bet. V'inei ilanei Gan Eden, the trees of Gan Eden, gazar behem la'asot anaf v'laset pri la'ad u'le'olam. God decreed that the trees of Gan Eden would bear fruit, and that the fruit would never wax old, that the fruit would be eternal. Lo yazkin be'eretz shorasham, the roots thereof would never wax old. Ube'afar lo yamut giz'am, and their stock would never die in the ground. A phrase from Eov. Ein tzuchin la'oved v'zomer, it doesn't need to be tended to. If you needed to tend to the trees of the garden, so who looked after them after Adam was removed from there? And they're planted by God. How do we know all this, says the Ramban? Because it says, because it says that the leaves shall not wither and the fruit shall not fail, because the waters issue from the sanctuary. But wait a second, Yechezkel is talking about waters from the sanctuary, and the Ramban just drew that as the source for the permanent nature of the tree, of the fruits of Gan Eden, because they are planted by God. So the Ramban certainly connects this parak of Yechezkel to the world of Gan Eden. And that begs the question, why suddenly is the Mikdash and Gan Eden so connected? So that brings us to our next point along this journey, which is Perek Bet of Breshit. I'm going to start with a very simple question. Where is Gan Eden? Gan Eden disappeared. We were expelled. Where is Gan Eden? Simple question. All right, so let's see if we can figure out where Gan Eden is. So we're going to jump to the description of Gan Eden, which is in Breshit Perek Bet, starting with Pasuk Chet. We're going to look at the description of Gan Eden and then the description where Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden. A little bit of a okay, let's go on. God planted a garden in Eden to the east, or from the east. And there he placed Adam, who he had formed. So now we have to know what this garden is. God enabled to grow from the ground every tree that is pleasing in appearance and food and tasty to eat. And amongst all the trees, the tree of knowledge, good and evil, and the tree of life. If you're wondering what the tree of knowledge, good and evil means, that is a good question. Philosophers and commentaries for over the centuries have tried to struggle with that. After sorting it through and wading through many different opinions, I'm going to share with you, hopefully, if not this week, next week, Rav Shimshon Nefal Hirsch's interpretation of Gan Eden. I think it is simple. It is the simplest and the most powerful, and will fit everything that we're saying. But we'll come back to that. Eitz HaChaim b'toch hagan ve'etz hadat, tree of knowledge, tree of life. Okay, where is Gan Eden? V'nahar yotzeh me'Eden. A river goes forth from Eden, just like that river that goes forth from the Mikdash. A river goes forth from Eden. Lashkot et hagan, and it waters the garden. Umisham yipared ve'haya la'arba'a rashim, and from there it divides, and it divides into 4 heads. So, from the river that waters Gan Eden, I have 4 other rivers that emerge. Everybody with me? Okay. What are those 4 other rivers? Shem echad Pishon. The first name is Pishon. Hu hasovevet kol eretz hachavila. This winds around the whole land of Chavila. Asher sham ha-zahav, a land of gold. Zahav ha'aretz ha'itov, land of pure gold, wonderful gold. Sham ha-bedolach ve'even ha-shoham. There, in the land of where this Eretz Nachal Pishon is, you will find bedolach stones and shoham stones. Now, I'm not translating them intentionally, because every single time they get translated by the same source, they get translated differently. It drives me crazy. So the same Ala Torah website translates the same word, bedolach and even shoham, here differently than it does somewhere else. I'm not sure how to process that. So I'm going to leave out the translation for now. They are named Bedolach stone and Eben HaShoham. V'shem Nahar Sheni Gichon. The second river is called the Gichon. V'hu hasovevet kol eretz Kush, and that winds around the land of Kush. Now, just a quick word about Kush. In modern Hebrew, Kush is Ethiopia. In biblical Hebrew, Kush is the southern half of Africa. Essentially divide what we refer to as the continent of Africa into 2 regions. The northern region is called Mitzrayim, and the southern region is called Kush. There are no other geographic locations in Africa mentioned other than those 2, and so essentially they divide up the various parts of the Nile, and the inhabitation of Africa revolves around the Nile. And so that is the land of Eretz Kush. Mishem Nahar Shloshi Chidekel. The third is called the Chidekel. That we know exactly where it is. The Chidekel is the Tigris River. Hu Alech Kidmat Ashur, because that one flows into Ashur or Assyria. V'Yanahar Aravi'u Prat, and the fourth is the Euphrates. So, to put this into visual terms, I'll come back to the Ramban in a second. To put this into visual terms, here is a visual aerial map of what we refer to as the Middle East. Here is Israel, Sinai. This is Ashur. This is the Euphrates and the Tigris, the Chidekel and the Prat, today modern-day Iraq. And here is the Nile, and more or less the southern part of the Nile, Eretz Kush, the northern Nile Delta in the land of Mitzrayim. And if these are the 4 rivers, let's assume for the moment, we don't know where the Gichon is, but I'm going to assume for the moment that if it's somewhere around here, just for the sake of argument, I have 2 over here and 2 over here, then more or less what I have is a description of the primary 4 rivers of what has been referred to as the Fertile Crescent. That is exactly the the center of civilization of the ancient world. Right? Egypt and Ethiopia, with the Nile River, along the Nile River in the southern continent of Africa, and the Tigris and the Euphrates, or essentially the Mesopotamia, and the land of Canaan in between. And that's exactly what I have. You can see it a little bit on this map as well. Right? You have the Nile River here, and you have the Euphrates and the Tigris here, Mesopotamia, and Canaan in the middle. Well, remember what the Torah described about Gan Eden. Gan Eden is in the middle, and then it separates into 4 rivers, 2 in the north and 2 in the south. I'm getting dangerously close to pinpointing Gan Eden somewhere in the middle. Well, somewhere in the middle is not here in Saudi Arabia. Somewhere in the middle would be Eretz Canaan.
I love this.
Says the Ramban. Let's go back up to the Ramban. Ramban and Perek Gimel. V'da, no. V'ha'amen, and believe. Ki Gan Eden ba'aretz. Gan Eden is on earth. Gan Eden is here in the land. This was a philosophical debate with many of the Rishonim and commentaries who wanted to argue that Gan Eden was a concept, it was a theory, it was an esoteric vision, it was a model, it didn't exist in physical terms. Chazal borrowed the term Gan Eden to refer to a person should have a lichtig Gan Eden, which is a reference to the notion of living in the world to come, in the world of the souls. But that's only because it's a borrowed term. In Tanakh, Gan Eden is a physical place. And the tree of knowledge and the tree of life are also physical things. We'll see that in a moment. And says the Ramban, Misham yetzeh hanahar vayipared la'arba'a rashim hanir'im lanu. And from there it separates into 4 rivers we can see. The Euphrates and the Tigris are not far from us. The Euphrates is the northern border of our land. Upishon u'anilus, the Pishon is the Nile of Mitzrayim, K'divrei Rishonim. The only river he doesn't identify is the Gihon, and that's not so hard to assume that the Gihon is the southern part of the Nile, which is essentially, or the northern part of the Nile, which is essentially 2 parts, 2 different rivers are identified in the Nile. But suddenly, I have a reference to Gan Eden in this world, in a physical place. More or less, the rivers that emerge from Gan Eden, that are the heads that emerge, that we can see, are on either side bracketing the land of Israel in the middle. Okay, so does that mean that Gan Eden is in the land of Israel? I'm going to leave that as an open question. Open question. However, what I'm more inclined to say is that the physical location of Gan Eden, once Adam and Chava emerge, are expelled from it, the rest of the garden is irrelevant. I would even argue, maybe not in accordance with the Ramban, that the rest of the garden is left to wither and die. Because once Adam is removed from Gan Eden, the rest of the garden is irrelevant. The only part of the garden that's relevant is the one part of the garden that was preserved, which was the Eitz HaChaim guarded by the Kruvim and the sword, the fiery sword. That's the end of the story. Let's just jump there for a minute. The end of Perek Gimel. Vayomer Hashem Elokim, after Adam and Chava eat of the tree, which, by the way, we all understand is not an apple tree, right? I'm assuming that is understood by all. Definitely not an apple tree. Apples are not indigenous to the land, to the region. That's a much later translation. Most likely a fig tree, because that's what they they make themselves skins from the fig leaves. So most likely a fig tree, unclear, but it doesn't matter. Vayomer Hashem Elokim, Hein ha'adam haya ki echad mimenu ladat tov v'ra. Now that man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, whatever that means. If he takes the tree of life, he'll live forever. Can't have that. And therefore, God expels him from Gan Eden. and to go work the field. Adam, man is banished. Listen carefully. Vayashken mikedem legan Eden, God places, from the word shachen or mishkan, God places to dwell east of the Garden of Eden, et kruvim. Access is guarded by the kruvim. I don't know how to translate kruvim, cherubs. That's not a translation, that's a transliteration. Some kind of malach, some kind of angel. With a firing, swirling sword. Lishmor et derech eitz hachaim, to guard access to the tree of life. That's the only part of Gan Eden that's left. The eitz hachaim, the tree of life, and the kruvim that guard access to it. Hold that image in your head for a moment. Okay? Open parentheses. I just want to address the question of the Eitz Hadat for a second, because this pasuk raises a really fascinating issue. What was the Eitz Hadat? Here the pasuk says that God says that man became like him, like God, consuming the tree of knowledge. So I'm just going to put out there Rav Shimshon of Hirsch's interpretation. It's not on the source page. I apologize. I'm going to give it to you orally. Rav Hirsch argues that there is nothing, and there's a huge debate in the commentaries about it, that the tree of knowledge did not transform Adam and Chava in any way. The purpose of the tree of knowledge was not to transform him, to imbue him with new knowledge. The purpose of the tree of knowledge, says Rav Hirsch, was to be a symbol of God's authority. Tov and Ra are defined not by what is, but by who says so. The authority over Tov and Ra belongs to God. God put man in Gan Eden in an eternal existence with the understanding that he would accept God's authority. God says right, God says wrong. God says don't eat of that tree for no reason other than God said so. It's the first chok in the Torah. And the symbol of authority is what is at stake. When the serpent or Nachash or whatever it is says to Chava that there's really nothing wrong with the tree, but rather this is the Nachash speaking to Chava and says to her, Ki yodea Elohim ki biyom acholchem mimenu v'nifgechu elech enechem v'item ke'Elohim yodei tov v'ra. When you eat of the tree, your eyes will be open and you will be godlike. Not knowing good and evil, but having the authority to determine what is good and what is evil and what is bad. God said, don't eat of the tree because God said it's bad. I'm telling you, you make that decision. And so she opens her eyes and she sees that the tree is beautiful and that it's tasty and that it's desirable. And so she consumes it. And she's immediately overridden with shame. And there's much to unpack there, but that's not our topic. God confirms what the Nachash says. Man has become ki achad mimenu, like us, meaning authority, usurped that authority. Therefore, he loses the access to the tree of life or eternal life. Says a verse, it's either or. Either you accept God's authority willingly, or you accept God's authority because ultimately you become mortal, and in mortality, nobody can be godlike. One or the other. To Rav Hirsch, the whole purpose of Gan Eden was to symbolize that recognition of God's dominion. And when you dethrone God and you enthrone man and you expelled from Gan Eden, the next story, of course, is Cain kills Hevel, and the world continues from that direction. We'll talk about that later. All right. So that's just a closed parenthesis on to the story of Gan Eden itself. But I'm fascinated by this reference to the rivers of Gan Eden on the one hand, and on the other hand, the tree of life and the kruvim that guard access to it as the only part of Gan Eden that's left. You can already begin to see the pattern that is filling in here. Let's go to a medrash. This is a medrash Tanchuma, in source 7. There's a medrash in its typical style, jumps images and imagery. Bati legani achoti kala. I've come to my garden, my sister, my bride. The garden in Shir Hashirim. This is a subject for Shir Hashirim study, but just be aware. Shir Hashirim is the story of a beloved and a lover kind of chasing each other. But the gan, the garden, essentially being the place where they meet, the place where they have an intimate relationship, and in the interpretation of Shir Hashirim, remember, written by, again, according to tradition, written by Shlomo HaMelech, and Shlomo is mentioned by name in Shir Hashirim, HaMelech Shlomo. Bati legani, I've come to my garden. What is the garden that Shlomo HaMelech built for the intimacy with God? Is a reference to the temple. So Amar of Shmuel bar Nachman, when God created the world, says Shmuel bar Nachman, God wanted to have an abode below, on earth, as he has on heavens. So Barat Adam, he created man, and he commanded him one thing. Amalo, I'll give you one thing. Accept my dominion over good and evil in the tree of knowledge, and you can stay in Gan Eden. And Gan Eden is characterized as a place in which Kol Elokim mitalech bagan, the voice of God, Vayishmu et Kol Hashem Elokim mitalech bagan, the voice of God walking in the garden. Gan Eden was a place of prophecy. Gan Eden was a place of communication between God and man. Gan Eden was a source for the mitzvah, the command of the Eitz Hadat. Gan Eden was the source of a closeness, of an intimacy with God. God clothed Adam and Chava in Gan Eden. But man violated that command. So Kadosh Baruch Hu told him, I only wanted a dira b'tachtonim. I wanted a presence amongst man. And the one thing I commanded you, and you didn't listen. So Sileka Kadosh Baruch Hu Shechinato l'rakia harishon, pushing God's presence, the Shechina, off one level. There are, by Kabbalistic tradition, there are 7 levels of heavens between us and God. Every major transgression that takes place, that's recorded in the Chumash, pushes God one step away. Kain kills Hevel, God moves further away. Dor Hamabul, there's man pushes God even further away. Until finally, Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu Shivada Kiyim Barati, I created 7 heavens. V'ad achshav yesh v'she'im lamod ba. And until now, the wicked have had full reign. So what did he do? He took all of the generations and all of the wicked, and he established one person who would bring God back into the world, Avraham. Avraham brought God's presence to the 6th level. Yitzchak brought God on the Akedah, brought God's level down to the 5th. Moshe brought it down to the earth. Vayered Hashem al Har Sinai. Now listen carefully. Uchtiv bati legani achoti kala. And finally God came to his garden. When? Kishu kama mishkan. When the Mishkan was built. In other words, we started in Gan Eden and we ended in the Mishkan. Or, if again it's a somewhat of an anachronistic medrash built around Shir Hashirim, we started in Gan Eden and we ended in the Mikdash. We started in Gan Eden with rivers, and we ended in Gan Eden in the Mikdash with a river that feeds trees on either side that don't wither and that don't fall. And now it gets even more interesting. Okay, now it gets even more fascinating. Remember, I told you the names of the rivers. So we had Gihon, and we had Pishon, we had Chidekel, and we had Prat, Euphrates. So now it gets even more interesting. I'm going to skip. We went through this chart for a second. I'm going to jump. I'm going to come back to this. This is really my clincher, but we'll come back to that. One of the rivers was Gihon. And the Gichon, Sovevet Kol Eretz Kush, was identified as the one that went through the land of Kush, or Mitzrayim, part of the Nile. The Gichon, by the way, is also the name of the river, or the name of the valley and the river that forms the foundation of Yerushalayim, right? So that's an interesting connection. But the description of the region of this river had Zahav and pure gold, and it also was identified as the land of the Bedolach and the Shoham stones. And here's where things get really interesting. Anybody recognize the Shoham stone? The Shoham stone is Avnei Shoham, Avnei Miluim, Leifod B'Lachoshen. The Shoham stone were the stones that stood on the shoulder part of the apron of the Kohen Gadol in the Beit HaMikdash. The other stones were the Choshen stones, if you remember, the breastplate stones. We'll come back to those.
Okay.
But the Beit HaMikdash was characterized by being built out of pure gold. Udvir, the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies in the Beit HaMikdash, was where the Aron Brit Hashem, where the Ark stood, was made out of pure gold. Was made out of pure gold. And so this reference to pure gold, Zahav Haaretz Tov, suddenly takes on purity, takes on a new meaning, especially when you compare it with the Avnei Shoham. I'll go one step further. This Bedolach stone is intriguing. This one I can't prove to you, but this is just fascinating. The Bedolach is mentioned somewhere else in Tanakh. It's mentioned in the context of another aspect of the Holy of Holies, namely, inside the Holy of Holies, there were three things. There was the Ark with the tablets of the Ten Commandments, of the tablets of the covenant. There was the Kruvim. Well, actually, the Ark, the Kruvim, and the Luchot, all one unit. But in addition to that, there were two other elements that were put there later. One is the staff of Moshe that was put there after the rebellion of Korach. And the other was a little jug of man, of the man that fell in the desert, referred to as Tzinsenet HaMan. Now, it happens to be that the man is the only other thing that is described as compared to or looking like the Bedolach stone. Haman kezera gadu ve'eno ke'ena bedolach. The man looked like coriander seed, and its appearance was like the appearance of bedolach. And here I come back to that issue that every time the word bedolach appears, it gets translated differently. Here it's translated as bedylium, here it's translated as pearls. I have no idea what the translations are. But the fact that the bedolach describes the man, and the man sat on the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and the shoham was the stones on the apron of the high priest. Suddenly I'm getting dangerously close to the world of the Mikdash in a description of the elements of Gan Eden. Let's go back to the piece I skipped. I'm going to read you the whole parak in a moment. This parak Chavchet of Yechezkel is vitally important. But I just want to point this out. This is a chapter in Yechezkel in which Yechezkel is writing a prophecy against the king of Tzor. Now, the king of Tzor is Melech Tzor is Shlomo Melech's partner in the building of the Beit HaMikdash. Hiram Melech Tzor. He supplies the wood, he supplies the effort and the camp and the workers, etc. We looked at that a little bit last week. Ben Adam Simkinal Melech Tzor. Set up a lamentation of the king of Tzor. And tell him the following: you sealed the perfect proportion is just find here. Full of wisdom and beauty. You are. You built something. You sealed the plans for something which was full of beauty and wisdom. What did Hiram build? He built the Beit HaMikdash. How is it described here? Be'eden gan Elohim hayita. You were in Eden, the garden of God. You were surrounded by the most precious stones that adorned you. What were the stones that adorned you, Melech Tzor, when you stood in Gan Eden? Odem, Pitita, Yahalom, Tashish, Shoam, Yeshve, Sapir, Nofach, Ubarkat, Zahav. Wonderful stones. But I have no idea what they are. But it doesn't matter what they are. Because you know what they are? They are 9 out of 12 of the stones of the breastplate of the Choshen of the Kohen Gadol. Shmot Perek Chavchet. Here are the stones of the Kohen Gadol. Odem, Pitita, Ubareket, Nofach, Sapir, Yahalom, Leshem, Shva, and Achlama, Tarshish, Sham, V'yashveh. Line them up. 9 out of the 12 are here. And then the gold, of course, the gold chains, the Zahav. Melech Tzor built the Beit HaMikdash. The Navi says, you stood in Gan Eden. You stood amidst the stones of Gan Eden because you stood in the Beit HaMikdash. You, King of Tzor, At Kruv Mimshach HaShochech, you anointed with Kruvim as covers. Unetaticha Ba'ar Kodesh Elohim, I placed you on the holy mountain of God. B'toch Avnei Eshi Talachta, amidst stones of fire. This is not interpretation. This is the pshat of the Perek. You built the Beit HaMikdash, and it was as if you stood in the Garden of Eden. Well, it's more than as if you stood in the Garden of Eden. You did stand in the Garden of Eden, because that's what the Mikdash is. Wait a second. Let's go further. We're not done. What happened at the end of Gan Eden? Man is expelled. Man is expelled. What's the only thing left of Gan Eden? The Eitz HaChaim, the tree of knowledge. The tree of life. Eternity. It's the only thing left of Gan Eden. And what guards access so that man is barred access to the Garden of Eden lest he live forever? Remember that word? Mikedem leGan Eden et HaKruvim. There's 2 kruvim that guard access to the Eitz HaChaim that prevent man from ever accessing that place. Okay, what other place is guarded by 2 kruvim and preventing us from gaining access there too?
Aron Kodesh.
Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies. It's exactly what it is. Vayas b'dvir shnei kruvim. There are 2 kruvim. Shlomo Melech built 2 kruvim in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Moshe built 2 kruvim on top of the Aron. V'asita shnayim kruvim zahav, made out of pure gold. And those kruvim guard access. Now, there's other kruvim as well. There's kruvim on the embroidered curtain that prevents you in the Mishkan from going into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, a warning from the outside as well. These angels with a fiery sword, they guard access. You may not enter the Kodesh HaKadoshim. If you enter the Kodesh HaKadoshim unannounced, you die. Because the Kodesh HaKadoshim guards something very precious. The Holy of Holies guards something very, very precious. What does it guard? The Torah. Correct? Shlomo Melech, Mishlei, B'ni, Torati al tishkach. Don't forget my Torah. Mitzvotai yitzur libecha. Let my commandments form in your heart. Ki orech yamim ushnot chayim, because these commandments, this Torah, will provide you length of days. Orech yamim bimina, length of days is in the right hand, bismola osher v'kavod, and the left hand is osher and kavod. Sounds like Shlomo's challenge? It's paths are paths of pleasantness, paths of peace. We say it every Shabbos. Eitz chayim hi lamachazikim ba. The Torah is a tree of life to those who grasp it. So to put the pieces of the picture together, inside of the Kodesh HaKadoshim sits the ark with the Torah, which is the Eitz Chaim, which is the tree of life, guarded by the Kruvim, to which we are not allowed access except if we free ourselves from the shackles of sin and mistakes and chet through the process of tshuva, and then that one day a year of Yom Kippur, when we dressed in white, we can return to the Kodesh HaKadoshim, just as Adam and Chava could maybe have a taste of what Gan Eden was all about. What was the primary connection point of the Garden of Eden? It was a place in which God's voice, prophecy, walked with man. They heard the voice of God walking in the garden. What was the source? What was the purpose of the Kodesh HaKadoshim? Not in terms of the ark and the kruvim, but in terms of its functionality. Bamidbar Perek Zayin, when Moshe entered into the Ohel Moed, Vavo Moshe al Ohel Moed, the Daber to speak to God, Vayishma et kol midaber elav. Moshe heard the voice speaking to him from atop of the kaporet, which was on the Aron HaIdut, mi ben shnei hakuvim, between the kruvim. The Kodesh HaKadoshim was the power pack to the process of prophecy. Which is why, by the way, in the Second Temple, when the power pack was lost and they didn't have the ark, very quickly, prophecy waned and disappeared. The ark was the mechanism both for the functionality of the breastplate of the high priest, which was another point of communication, and for the power of prophecy. Shmuel is described as having been the one to awaken prophecy after so many years of prophecy waning and dwindling. And the beginning of Sefer Shmuel, he's described as sleeping in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Pull it all together, and what you have is a picture that the Torah starts with. The Torah starts with Gan Eden. The Torah starts with the story of the Garden of Eden. It's central. It's the point of connection between God and man. But there, in that garden, there are two choices. You can either accept God as your king. That's what the purpose of the Garden of Eden was. That's the tree of knowledge. You let God make those decisions. Or you usurp that throne, says Rav Hirsch, and then you are expelled from the garden because you need to recognize God as king by your own mortality. But it's either or. Mortality plays a huge role. Shlomo Melech is haunted by mortality because Shlomo embraced the tree of knowledge. Shlomo embraced the Eitz Hadat. Shlomo embraced the same mistake that Adam and Chava faced. He was given the same test. Shlomo was about to build the Beit HaMikdash. The Beit HaMikdash is Gan Eden. Let me say that again. The Beit HaMikdash is the Garden of Eden. The river, the waters, the kruvim, the Eitz HaChaim, whatever that Gan Eden represented in the beginning and the introduction of the Chumash, is transformed into the role of the Mishkan and the Mikdash in Yerushalayim and the land of Israel between the heads of the four waters. That's what it is. When we return to the Kodesh HaKadoshim on Yom Kippur, we are returning to Gan Eden. Gan Eden doesn't disappear from the story of Chumash. Gan Eden is its central theme. It just takes on a new meaning, takes on a new structure. It takes on a new format. That format is called the Mikdash, the temple. That format is called the Holy of Holies. And all the conversations around the Holy of Holies, all the conversations around building the Beit HaMikdash are all informed by its theme of the Eitz HaChaim that stands at its middle, at its center, the kruvim that guard it, and the notion that we can come back to it only if we embrace the Torah, if we embrace the Eitz HaChaim. Okay, I have 3 minutes left. I want to show you two more things quickly. And I'm going to go back to my share screen. The one more chapter that I didn't get to, which is and here you really see it all together. When Yechezkel is talking to the king of Tzor, and he's talking to generations later, but essentially he is representing the kingdom of Tzor by its role in co-building the temple with Shlomo. And listen to the language with which he challenges the king of Tzor. He's really talking to Shlomo. He's just presenting this as to the king of Tzor. Ben Adam, and more than a Gitzor, Koma Hashem Elokim. Yan gava libacha vatomer el ani, because you have become so haughty as to think that you are a God. But really, Moshav Elohim yeshavti b'lev yamin. Or you're saying, I sit in the seat of God in the midst of the seas. You are a man, not a God. But you are haughty enough to think yourself as God. You are wiser than Daniel. This is not Daniel of our book of Daniel. There's a whole discussion of who it is, not for now. You are wise, no secret is hidden from you. Think Shlomo, right? Your wisdom. In your wisdom and understanding, you became very wealthy. And you've obtained gold and silver in your treasures. Think Shlomo. With your great wisdom and your traffic, you've increased your riches, and with that came your arrogance. So how do you take somebody who's the wealthiest person in the world, who's the richest person in the world, who's the wisest person in the world, who's the most powerful person in the world, and say to them, you are not God? Mortality is the only way. Because you've set your heart as the heart of God. I will bring strangers upon your land, terrible nations, and they will draw their swords against you, and they will defile your brightness. They will bring you down into the grave. And you will die in the death of those who are slain in the heart of seas. Do you think you can say, I am God, in the face of your own mortality? And then he continues exactly the piece that I said before. Simkina Melech Tzor set up a lamentation for the king of Tzor, who's now in this image been killed, and say to him, you built the perfect design, you filled with beauty, etc. You were in the Garden of Eden. You built with all of the stones of the Garden of Eden. You were anointed by kruvim at kruvim shechasochech. And with all of this beauty, your heart was arrogant and lifted up, and therefore you've corrupted your wisdom, and you have been brought down into the grave. Think Shlomo HaMelech, who, as the moment he builds the temple, embraces the tree of knowledge. And his wisdom, well known throughout the world, is also his arrogance, because he violates the very three commands that were designed to keep arrogance in leadership at bay. The whole purpose of the three prohibitions for a king was so that his heart would not be haughty against his fellow, so that he would remain loyal to Torah, that he would carry the Torah with him in his chambers, in his throne, on his way, and not become more arrogant. Shlomo HaMelech did the exact opposite. Shlomo HaMelech built the Beit HaMikdash. Shlomo HaMelech built Gan Eden. And at that moment chose to embrace the tree of knowledge. Chochmah, Osher, Kavod. God says, okay, I gave you the test of Adam HaRishon. I gave you the test of Adam and Chava. You're going to rebuild Gan Eden. You're going to go back to the world of Adam and Chava. You're going to you're going to be retested with exactly the same test. And you know what? Kohelet is a testimony to the fact that he failed. Because in Kohelet, he's literally torn between the two trees of the Eitz Hadat and the Eitz HaChaim, and he can't have both. He can't have the entire enterprise of this world and remain immortal. It doesn't work. That's exactly what Kohelet struggles with. It takes Shlomo's entire life to realize that if you want to return to the temple, you want to embrace the Eitz HaChaim, not the Eitz Hadat. It is God's world. It is God's domain. It is God's loyalty. It is God's command and not your wisdom to outthink, to outsmart the Ribono Shel Olam. So what I've presented to you in the last hour, I hope, is a kind of an overview. There's much, we could do the whole course on this, but it is an overview of the world of Gan Eden and how it informs the imagery around the temple itself. And so Shlomo, who builds the temple and who struggles with the concepts of mortality and life and good and evil, but remember, Shlomo's struggling with the perspective of what he sees, what his own personal experiences are. That's exactly what the Eitz Hadat is. Eitz Hadat is, I want to take that knowledge for myself. I want to acquire it. I want to see it. I want to master it. I want to be the authority over it. Somebody said, what would a mortality have meant for Shlomo? I don't know, but I know what it would mean for David. David also wanted to build the temple. David wanted to build the temple. His whole life was to build the desire and a dream to build the temple. David Melech knew exactly that the temple was a rebuilding of Gan Eden. So you know what he says? One thing I desire, that which I seek, to build the temple for what purpose? Shivti b'vet Hashem koyimei chayai lachzot b'noam Hashem ulevaker b'heichalo. To sit in the sanctuary and bask in his presence. David HaMelech's world of Tehillim begs, yearns, full of love, full of desire, full of passion, full of energy, yearns to sit, have that opportunity to sit in the sanctuary, kirvat elokim litov, and just absorb the world of the temple, the world of Gan Eden. If David HaMelech represents the notion of a love and a devotion and loyalty to God, Shlomo HaMelech represented the Eitz Hadat. Now think about God's promise to each of them. God made a promise to each of them. He made a promise to David, made a promise to Shlomo. What was his promise to David? For all eternity, a son will sit on your throne. What was his promise to Shlomo? I will split the kingdom away from you and your kingdom will end. To David, he promised the Eitz HaChaim. To Shlomo, he promised the Eitz Hadat. And it's exactly the contrast between them. And that's, in a sense, when we started our journey of Kohelet, I said it was a tragic book. It's a tragic book because Shlomo's a failure. But we know he's a failure. We know that he's a failure from the book of Kings. What Kohelet is a testimony to his own assessment as to why. And it starts here. Okay, we'll stop here. Next week, B'ezrat Hashem, we're going to start to explore chapter 3 and take apart each one of these personalities one by one and see what they contribute, what their positive aspect is, and what their negative aspect is, and how they navigate through this complexity that we have just set up. I appreciate you sitting and listening to me for the last hour. I will try to save the chat. I forgot to do that last week, so I apologize. And that way I will hopefully take a look at any of the questions. But I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes now if people have questions, and just unmute yourself and feel free to chime in. Okay, that's usually a worry, because either it means that I wasn't clear or they bored you out of listening, or that you'll think about what we said. This would be the positive side. Think about what we said, process it, and Mirz Hashem, if you have any questions, once again, I'll put my email in the chat. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, email me, and I will be happy to continue this conversation. But in the meantime,
fascinating.
Thank you.
I agree.
Most interesting. Most interesting.
I appreciate that. It is my pleasure.
Yeah, I look forward to the next chapter.
Thank you.
So rich what
Thank
you
you.
do.
Yeah, okay. Chag
All right.
Sameach.
Chag Sameach, everybody.
Yes.
We will be on Zoom. Sorry, we will be on schedule next Tuesday, even if it's Chol Hamoed. If you can't make it because it's Chol Hamoed, not to worry. It'll be recorded and it will be on the website. Usually gets posted a day or two after the shir. Have a wonderful day.
תודה
You
רבה.
too.
You as
ונשתמע.
well.
Tודה רבה.
Tודה רבה.
Shema
תודה
tov.
רבה.
Really, it's so fascinating.
My pleasure.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah.